Welcome to ESGX Live, the community for education and information to inspire collaboration and action on all things to do with sustainability. And we have a very topical discussion coming up today. I think we all know people that have found the whole world of COVID incredibly stressful. Many of us will have experienced the feeling that maybe we were out of the woods late last year, and then we've had the Omicron wave, and more uncertainty lies ahead. There's lots of data around the great resignation or reshuffle, people quitting their jobs, looking for something different. And very often this is not about money per se, it's about quality of life and other things. All of this particularly affects young people more than anything. And so we will be digging into that. But first, before we get there, we have our monthly Green Jobs Report with Fidel Kaboub and Amir Khalegi. And to lead us into all of that, we have my co-host, Paul Herman, in Chicago, I believe. So Paul, over to you. I'm fascinated to see what we've got in store today.
Thank you, Nigel. Great to see you and your super high-tech background, keeping tab on all the news around the world, time zone by time zone. So hello, everybody. This is Paul Herman of HIP Investor, and today's our monthly Green Jobs Report. Also, our special guest will be Liz Medina, who's the head of the AFL-CIO chapter in the state of Vermont. So we'll go deeper into what's happening on the front line of work and labor. But first, welcoming Amir Khalegi, PhD candidate at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, which will be happening this year, presumably, Amir. And also a research fellow at the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. So Amir, it's a volatile beginning to 2022, and that's happening in the workforce, in inflation, and at least in the stock markets this week. So excited to hear the latest of what you have to share. And during your presentation, both Liz Medina and I will have some commentary. And then we'll, at the end of that, Liz will go deeper into a frontline view of what's happening with labor at work and unions. And then Dr. Fidel Kaboub and Nigel and I will join the discussion as well. So Amir, over to you.
Perfect. Yes, thank you, Paul. And like Paul was saying, just as there's volatility in the stock markets, like this past week, over the past 4 or 5 months, there's been extreme volatility in the labor market as well, and we're going to be diving into those topics today. So thank you for those of you who are joining us today, returning and first time. This is our January Green Jobs Report, which provides data-driven insights on moving towards a more sustainable, greener economy. As an overview, our analysis begins with human impact plus profit ratings, which is developed by HIP Investor. They're on a basis of 7 HIP metric pillars of health, wealth, earth, equality, trust, products and services, and management practices. These metric pillars are used to rate companies, whether they be US or across the globe. Specifically, we focus on US companies in our report, and there are over 2,000 companies that we map to various industries within the United States using the North American industry classification system. Using the HIP metric pillars and current employment statistics survey data that's provided by the BLS, we're able to give a weighted industry rating. And those ratings span from green industries, which span from 50 to 75. The current ceiling is 75. The slightly extractive industries would have a HIP rating from 25.1 to 50, and extractive industries which have a HIP rating from 0 to 25. Example
and
industries.
Amir, if you could start sharing your screen, that'll help enhance.
Oh, I apologize. Wow, I apologize, guys.
That's okay. You knew it well, so it was easy to follow.
Yeah.
Here's a visual to go with it.
Right. So here are the, you guys are seeing my screen correctly, right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Apologize for that, guys.
No problem.
But yeah, so here are the HIP pillars, our in-depth analysis, the industry mapping, and then towards our weighted industry HIP rating. And where I was at was seeing these bullet points here. That is examples of industries that would be labeled green, slightly extractive, or extractive. So moving on to my next slide. What we have here is a graph kind of depicting the hipness of the US economy. So unbundling this graph, if we're looking at the blue line, that is the economy hip rating, and the dark dashed line is the unemployment rate. And what we're noticing here is that as unemployment went higher, the HIP economy rating went higher because more extractive jobs were lost during that initial COVID-19 impact. But as we build back, we are returning to those same extractive industries rather than building back to greener industries. And this can be noticed by looking at the dash line going down, which is the unemployment rate, while also the total economy HIP rating going down as well.
And so, Mayor, just a quick follow-up. A couple episodes ago, we talked about both the job mix shifting, but also about companies shifting. And what's happening today is that the job mix is not really shifting, and companies are not yet shifting. A little bit with wealth, and so we'll get into that shortly, but not yet in environmental or natural capital. So we need to both change the job mix and improve company performance.
And in terms of the shuffling as well, if we're looking at these three lines over here, the green, yellow, and red, which indicate the month-over-month change for green industries, slightly extractive industries, and extractive industries, this dip over here constituted in 20 million people losing jobs. So we had the opportunity to reshuffle these 20 million people to better, greener industries, but instead we're getting locked in a path dependency of these extractive industries. So moving on, we found that greener industries have been the most resilient to job loss during the COVID-19 recession. In comparing to the February 2020 employment level, slightly extractive industries are below that level by a fraction of a percent, around 0.8%. Green industries is reduced by around 1.6%, and extractive industries are the slowest to recover and have the largest gap between the current employment and the February 2020 level of employment, reduced by 2.7%. So yeah, definitely. This is and what we're showing here is that on this next slide is going to be the distribution of jobs within the industries. But going back to this over here, as we started returning, there was an extreme uptick in returning to slightly extractive industries, but nothing was changing. So like, although companies were in a slightly extractive industry, it didn't mean that those companies could improve, but we hadn't seen any like material data that had shown that they're improving or doing much to respond to the COVID-19 crisis. So we were moving back into more extractive practices. Just because a company or an industry is slightly extractive right now, it doesn't mean that it always has to be slightly extractive or extractive. There can be material things that are done to move towards a more sustainable practice of like those pillars: health, wealth, earth, equality, and trust. But moving on, this distribution that we have right now, unfortunately, is the majority are in slightly extractive and not the mix that Paul was talking about earlier. We're not seeing any substantial improvements towards the greener industries, the greener industry hip bucket. So we can see right now that, you know, around 99 million jobs within the United States are within this slightly extractive hip bucket. And slightly extractive, as I think I'll be able to show in this next slide, doesn't mean that the products and services that the company or the industry is providing is not good, right? It's not that every pillar is bad. It's that some pillars are coming up, but that doesn't mean we can take a reduction in the way, like if the products and service is really good, it doesn't mean that we can do a reduction on the way that we treat the people who provide those products and services, which can maybe be seen even in this chart here with the top industry losers of nursing care facilities. One of the highest products and services rating scores on this chart, but we are not treating the people who work in these industries, the leaders, like in managers or whatever it may be, management practices, whatever the metric may be, the workers that are providing this needed service are not being treated correctly. Therefore, it's impacted on their ratings. So there's a
So Amir, let's take a pause right here because Liz is based in Vermont, and Liz, the jobs in Vermont, several of them are in healthcare, right? Do you know the exact, approximate percentage?
Well, in Vermont, we invest a lot in our social service programs. In fact, Vermont has the second highest per capita spending on social welfare programs in the United States. And a lot of them are in the public sector, but we do have a lot of the unorganized workers here in Vermont in the private sector, in the various care fields. And we are trying to, as a labor organization, prioritize organizing because these workers are being hit so hard. They have so many demands on them in terms of working hours and the intense emotional and physical and skilled work actually that they bring to caring for our most vulnerable populations. And yet they're also being paid peanuts. I'm hearing from workers in these industries who are, for instance, doing residential care work, who have worked more than 10 years at a particular nonprofit or other agency and are still making under $15 an hour.
Wow, that's amazing. Which the minimum wage in Vermont is how much?
I believe it's $12.55 and then $6.38 for tipped workers.
Right. So yeah, and $15 an hour is $30,000 a year at full time, and so $12 an hour is $24,000 a year. So it's hard to make a living at those levels of income.
Absolutely. It takes about $22 an hour to be able to afford a 2-bedroom apartment here in Vermont. And that was before COVID, and the rental and housing market in Vermont has gone, it's become really hot and even more unaffordable since.
Well, Amir, you have some data on pay coming up.
Yes. Next. Oh, yes. Perfect. Yeah, perfect. So yeah, on the topic of pay, greener jobs pay significantly more. That is kind of like a facet, but it's not the only facet of the job. It's just correlated that, compensation will come along when managers or the leaderships within companies see that the workers should be fairly compensated for the type of work that they are doing. And that can be the whole discussion with even the frontline workers and healthcare workers and, a misalignment of the type of compensation versus the health dangers and actually how impactful they are in moving and progressing from the day to day on like helping, I guess, like society and our communities as a whole.
And Liz, what have you seen in Vermont or the region of better run companies or worse run companies? Does this type of relationship exist or?
Well, as a labor council, I have to say, when you have a union and a unionized workforce, you tend to see better wages, better working conditions, because workers actually have a voice on the job. So those of our workers who are organized into labor unions in the caring economy, are faring better. They're still facing enormous hardships, which I could get into more, but they at the very least have a much higher floor in terms of wages. And they have better set hours. They're not being asked to work overnights and overtime day after day. Things like this that really go into not only someone's ability to survive, but their quality of life and work-life balance and, a healthier work culture.
Awesome. And we'll be talking more about that later in terms of the specific topic points. Great introduction to that topic point. So this next graph here is looking at wage growth since January 2010. So slightly extractive industries just recently passed wage growth, although green industries, again, are still significantly paying higher in terms of relative percent change since January 2010. Slightly extractive industries recently had passed, but this is also due to the lower quality, more extractive industries having to pay a higher premium for workers to stay or to even get them to interview. Employers are having to pay this higher premium to retain the employees that would previously work at a lower wage, but since post-COVID, being able to reevaluate their interests, their wants, and have more autonomy and like agency to demand and renegotiate their wages. And that's what kind of we're seeing right now with these increased levels of wage. And that goes to show too that people in greener industries, and we'll see like there is a report that is referenced in one of the later slides on an MIT study or Sloan MIT study that at a certain point compensation doesn't become all of it. So people within greener industries, compensation may not be growing, but socially forward values within company perceptions and alignment of employee values are growing, sort of thing. So thankfully, yes, wages are growing in slightly extractive industries, but that cannot be the only pillar that grows within it because it only gets you so far.
So Liz, what have you seen in sort of cumulative pay? Is this working on a cumulative basis in Vermont?
Do you mean in terms of like overall wage growth in a particular sector?
Yeah, sector or geography, city versus rural.
Sure. So, we are seeing that the state at least is, in terms of our the enormous amount of money that invests in its care economy here, which we need so much more from our federal government, of course, too, does really see the like that. We need to do better in retaining these workers, and wages are part of that retention plan. And we have right out the gate put an additional, I believe, $30 million into helping pay retention bonuses for frontline healthcare workers. And, that's going to help a little bit. So we are seeing that, more efforts to better compensate workers in the care economy. We are seeing some, maybe I'm hearing some like higher starting wages from workers, but I think there's, a long way to go, especially for the workers who are not organized yet.
Got it.
And I will also add, in terms of our specifically nursing and health professionals in our hospitals, we have an over-reliance here in Vermont on extremely high paid traveling nurses. And so, there is a lot of money that is being put into those contracts, but this nurses who are local working side by side are not necessarily seeing the same kind of investment in their wages, which can be really hard for our local nurses and attracting people to actually stay here.
Sure. And nurses has historically, for the past 10 to 15 years, been a top 10 job in demand, and both, job growth, but also demand for nurses. Amir, a quick question before we continue through the presentation here. These numbers, these are the BLS numbers per hour, right? So that's essentially salary, or does it include benefits or compensation anyway?
Compensation isn't tracked by the BLS. What we are looking at here is average hourly earnings and the rate over here. But for greener industries, although not shown in graph form here, the average hourly weekly hours that are provided is from 35 to 37 for the greener jobs. And as you get down to the slightly extractive, the mixture becomes anywhere from 32 to 35, or to 25 on average. Same with extractive industries. And what this notes is that although hourly wages might be going up, weekly hours are going down. So it's kind of like a rebalancing of one variable within the equation. So you're kind of just paying out the same thing. So that is something also to be aware of, that greener jobs do offer fuller, more permanent employment as compared to slightly extractive and extractive jobs.
Got it. Got it. So some of those businesses may be cutting back hours, or people may be choosing to work fewer hours, maybe.
Yeah.
But great. All right. Well, I want to make sure we have time for deeper discussion. So
Perfect. We can hurry it. So like we were saying here, or like we've done before, there's high contact versus low contact industry sectors, where we mimic a study that was by the St. Louis Fed using the occupational survey. So currently, looking at high contact versus low contact industries, we're currently, for high contact industries, around 2 million below the February 2020 level. And for low contact industries, we're about 450,000 below. But what we had found is that regardless of if an industry was in low contact or high contact, if the industry was greener, meaning rating above a 30 HIP rating in this case, it was more resilient to job loss, like regardless of whether it was a high contact or low contact industry, which just goes to show that greener industries are more resilient and do more to retain and prepare for whatever may happen. So bringing back to the discussion, looking at this graph again, as we are building back, we really do need to think about like what companies are doing, because like we have the opportunity here with a reshuffling of 20 million people losing jobs and being able to think about the things that they want out of life, and does my place of work align with my values and like where I find myself, like from a purpose standpoint. So we are still early in this. I think fortunately, unfortunately, since our green jobs report, we had no idea to predict that COVID was coming, but we've essentially tracked everything that's happened since COVID on a month-to-month basis for 16 months. So this is happening, right? We are building back to the same extractive industries, and
And there is a benefit, just one last thing on that chart, that blue line is the HIP rating of the economy. That is below 50. So the US economy is an extractive economy of people, of planet, of trust. But the current line is still above the pre-COVID. So it may be from the deeply extractive jobs not recovering as fast. So there's a slight improvement now versus pre-COVID, but there's so much more to do. All right, so Mary, you did some extra credit homework on the green jobs, so love to hear more about this, and Liz, your reaction to it.
So yeah, there's been a lot of great, I guess, like coin terms that go from the Great Awakening to the Great Renegotiation to the Great Resignation to the Great Reshuffling. All this is saying is that there's a lot of movement in the labor markets right now, sort of thing, and I'm sure those of you who are listening have heard the term labor shortage, supply shortage, in coin terms like this. But what we are seeing is that job seekers are currently pushing to renegotiate working conditions, and we are seeing quit rates increase to record highs since the statistic has even been recorded and tracked. We're also seeing record rates of employee burnout, as you can see from this chart from Indeed, looking at Gen Z, millennials, Gen X, and baby boomers, all having an increase from over the year in terms of burnout. And it's also to note that the types of burnout will be different based on industry. So like, high contact versus low contact, all of these workers will be experiencing like dramatically different reasons for burning out, but many people are burning out. And what are the reasons for those? The top leading reason from the Sloan Review MIT study that uses Culture 500 data, toxic corporate culture is the leading variable
reason for a change. It's 10 times more important than pay. 10 times more important than pay.
Exactly. So as we were saying,
Liz, what do you think about this? What do you hear this from your members in the union? Like, what is the role of culture? What is the level of burnout? What's happening on the front lines?
I think it really depends on the industry and the union. So in terms of how important toxic workplace culture is to the workers' concerns, I would say, when again, when there isn't a union there, it becomes even more important, because one of the most important things that unions bring in terms of wages and benefits that we all hear about and can see in various statistics is basic respect at the workplace. Management actually has to talk to the workers, come to the negotiating table, listen to what their employees think about their workplace and their working conditions. And what we see in unorganized workplaces all too often, even if it isn't necessarily an issue of pay, what I'm hearing from non-union workers coming to me wanting to organize is that they don't feel listened to at all. If there is a concern, they'll send it to the CEO or the top manager, and the manager will call a meeting and talk at them for an hour, and that's that. And the workers don't feel like they have the freedom and ability to really be heard and raise their voice. And then again, like when I was talking earlier about some of our lowest paid workers, most marginalized workers doing the most fundamental work to keeping us all alive and healthy, working in residential care, working in nursing homes, working with specialized populations, they are actually having terrible compensation issues, and their wages are probably really important and a reason why there is burnout.
Got it. Amir, do you want to cover who's quitting and why? The one last thing I want to point out before you switch slides is the age distribution in the bottom left. So somewhere between 1 out of 4, 1 out of 3 baby boomers might be feeling burnout, but half or more of millennials, or right now half of Gen Z. And so maybe they're earlier in their career, and so they're getting ground harder, being younger employees. Maybe there's a cultural shift about what's appropriate, for like work-life balance. But there's a big distinction in those age groups. All right, Amir, tell us about the quits, and then we'll move
Perfect.
to panel discussion.
So the graph that we are looking at right now is just the indexing of quits since 2000, and we can see with the most current data that it is at a record high. Doing a subsector split, what we're looking at right now is the quit rates between various industries using the red line, which is the total private, the rate of total private quits as a baseline. We're seeing an extremely huge gap in terms of leisure and hospitality quits. Even in business services, there is a larger gap. And although healthcare is lower than the rate of total private quits, for historically, this is still like unprecedented in the amount of workers within that industry quitting and feeling sensations of burning out.
And on this chart is the 2008-2009 Great Recession too. So these numbers now, 2 years into COVID, are higher than at any point in this tracked history.
Very true.
All right.
So what we're seeing here too is dwindling rates of labor force participation. A lot of the time, so we're at a level of around 61.8, which is the lowest we've seen since the 70s. And a lot of the reasoning for labor, like an argument that you'll hear about why labor force participation is lowering is because of the baby boomer generation cycling out, but that is also like not so true, because sometimes there's like friction in terms of transition for older generation coming back into the labor market, and having harder transition in terms of being harder to find transitionary careers or being victims of ageism. But what sparked labor force participation, like going up in the 70s, which is a little bit, outside of the topic, was just the introduction of the baby boomer population and women entering the workforce, plus a readjustment of the age groups. But what we really need, all that is trying to say is that this is unprecedented in the amount of quits, and also the legitimacy of how low the labor force participation rate is, and all of that coming together. Although we have a 3.9, or I believe it's 3.9 unemployment rate with the most current numbers, we also have to look at all the factors around it in terms of workers leaving the workforce and not being counted in the unemployment rate calculation due to feeling discouraged or just wanting a job but not being able to find that suitable match. And that can also be seen here by this gap that can be seen. What we're looking at here on the blue line is the total job openings. The red line is the unemployment level as an absolute amount in thousands, while also adding in those who are not in the labor force but indicated that they want a job. So even though there's labor shortage and saying that people are not wanting to work, there is still more people who are unemployed and have looked at the job for a job in the past 4 weeks. That is the statistical classification of being unemployed. And while also adding those who are not in the labor force but actively responded that they said that they want a job, there's still more people who are unemployed and want a job than there are total openings. So people want to work, they're just trying to find the right place of work that aligns with their individual interests.
So Liz, what are you seeing on this? Do you see this gap between want a job and job openings? Are there truly more people who want to work?
I think Vermont's pretty unique compared to other states in this department. We've always had historically a pretty low unemployment rate. And that's certainly the case right now. Right now, we have 3 job vacancies for every worker. That is a person who's actively looking for a job or participating in the labor market, right? And I know those statistics leave out a lot of people too sometimes, but we are seeing a lot of vacancies, and we are seeing many workplaces struggling to hire, even ones that offer fairly high wages and benefits from the get-go. And so, that's also translating a little bit into some more courage for workers. So here in Vermont, we do have a little bit more of an imbalance of more jobs than workers available.
Got it. So, Dr. Fado, welcome to the panel. Love to hear your observations on this deep dive analytics on the jobs market.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Amir, for a great presentation again. And Liz, welcome to the team on this panel, on this discussion. So, just a quick summary of what we've seen from the beginning of this venture, looking at green jobs since the beginning of the pandemics. When the economy first shut down, we had a clear observation that we've reported on a regular basis here, which is greener jobs were more resilient on the downturn during the crisis. They were safer during the pandemic. They paid better, and they continue to pay better to this day. Number 2, when we started reopening, we saw that greener jobs were coming back faster than the extractive, slightly extractive and more extractive industries. But now, as of this last Green Jobs report, we're seeing that the more extractive industries are catching up, and the slightly extractive industries are exceeding now the green jobs again. So we're not building back better, we're building back the same. In terms of this whole conversation about the Great Reshuffle, the Great Resignation, in a sense, this is really not new. And the numbers that Amir showed a minute ago, the huge gap between the job openings and the unemployed, plus those who are not included at officially unemployed, but you and I would colloquially refer to those individuals as unemployed. Right now, that gap is 6.3 million individuals. So we're still far from full employment. And when you dig into the reasons for why those individuals were excluded from the labor force, that includes people who are discouraged workers, that includes individuals who are working part-time for economic reasons, not because they want to be part-time, but because there's nothing available to them. You'll find that it's millions of people who are displaced from the labor force, not participating because of lack of availability of childcare or elderly care or adequate transportation, reliable transportation, whether it's personal transportation or public transportation. So this is sort of what we're hearing in these anecdotal references during the pandemic as to why are workers not going back to work. Initially, the assumption was they're getting a check from the government, the additional unemployment benefits, so they're not going to work. And what did we do? Several states started removing the unemployment benefits. Missouri was one of the first states. And what we saw is that there was no significant increase in people returning to the labor force. The assumption was you take away their unemployment benefits, they'll go back to work and they'll accept the conditions. And now we're finding that it's not necessarily the case. So even in terms of generational gap, looking at it from that perspective, it's across the board. The sentiment is there across the board. The MIT report that Amir referred to ranks the toxic workplace environment as the top reason why people are not, rushing back to the same abusive workplace conditions. And then finally, I think an important data point to emphasize from Amir's remarks earlier, which is the number of hours in each one of these categories of green jobs, less extractive and more extractive jobs. The greener jobs offer you the more hours on average, close to 37 hours, I believe, which means more likely to have benefits included. But the more extractive jobs, on average, we're looking at 25, 30 hours a week, which means most likely no benefits. And that explains why it's really hard to restart an economy during a pandemic with the same kind of abusive workplace conditions. And to conclude here, what we've been trying to do with this partnership with HIP is to develop a metric. And this metric is telling us it's a no-brainer. Greener jobs are better, they're more resilient, they pay better. They're the pathway to this just transition that we want. Now, what we need is an enforcement mechanism, a policy mechanism, and organizing on the labor side to call for a much more scientific transition to a better outcome for workers, for companies, for the economy as a whole. And then finally, as you said, Paul, the overall hipness of the economy is still extractive. So we have a long way to go. And we've had this opportunity to reset the economy on a more sustainable path. And so far, we haven't really put a dent in that transition.
Thanks for those deep insights, Fadl. So Liz, you are on the front line every day talking to current workers, labor union workers, workers who may want to be mobilized and organized, those who are thinking about it, may need to switch. So what's happening in your everyday life and work to help support them and advance this?
Yeah, absolutely. So as a state labor council, we are a federation of labor unions, and we mostly represent workers in the public sector here in Vermont. And of course, we're looking to prioritize organizing and represent more workers in the private sector and public sector as well. But I have to say, one exciting silver lining, in addition to workers standing up for themselves individually against really horrible working conditions that have been going on for far too long, is that within organized labor, we're seeing increased militancy and participation from union members in their unions and in politics more generally. And I think we're seeing a larger movement to transform our unions and our labor councils as a result. I just spoke with a young worker just recently who I was asking, why did you decide to get involved in union? This worker had been at her job for only a couple of years, and she went from being a union member with not much knowledge about unions at all to becoming a kick-ass president of her union. And she has some of the most highest participation rates I've seen in any of our affiliate unions. They are increasing their membership percentage day after day. They are affected by the Janus ruling, so they have to actively get people to sign up and pay dues. It's very hard work. And she said she got involved in our union, was motivated to do it because the COVID pandemic was an eye opener for her, and it revealed all what the real problems in society were, and where the power is concentrated, and how workers need to fight back to have more of a say in their workplace, so they aren't just disregarded and treated as disposable, and that their health and their lives and their families don't matter. So I think this is a really class conscious raising moment for our members as well. And as a labor council, we were starting on this path since before then with our reform slate that we ran for our Labor Council United in 2019, of which I'm honored to have been a part. Now I'm just the executive director, but I was part of that slate. And, we really tried to forge a new vision for the labor movement that wasn't afraid of going on strike, that wasn't afraid of really bringing in meaningful union democracy and working class democracy, which we mean by, finding ways to transform our governments to have more direct participation and gaining some independence from the political class, particularly the Democratic Party, in order to do that. So I think, this is a real big moment for organized labor, and for the unorganized workers. I have seen so many people consciously reaching out to me, knowing that they have leverage now and they're less afraid to organize because they're not so easy to replace.
And how does that, does the propensity to get more active or to organize, does it differ, at least in Vermont or in the region, in your experience, by sector, by age, by urban, rural? Are there differences, or is it the same?
That's a great question. And I wish I had hard data to share with you. The propensity to get organized, I think we are seeing a lot, as your data actually does probably indicate a little bit, more activity from the younger generations of workers. And I would say that is the bulk of the interest, actually, in terms of the unorganized who want to become organized, and also the organized who are stepping up to really lead their unions and their workplaces. It's no secret that, these workers, the younger generations, have a lot less stake in capitalism. It hasn't delivered for them. They have enormous amounts of student debt. They aren't able to get on that path to the so-called American dream, to home ownership and any kind of stability in their life. And they really don't have a whole lot to lose. And so they only have things to gain at this point. And so they are trying to reach out and figure out how to do that at an unprecedented level, I would say.
And did I hear you right? Is there support or friction from different political parties? Are the Democrats supportive, or is there a gap? Most people would guess Republicans, there's a gap because there's more of a tilt towards business or independence or picking yourself up by your bootstraps. So how does it differ by political party?
It differs quite a lot, as you would probably presume. And as a labor council, we put a moratorium on our de facto support of the Democratic Party starting in 2019 with our United Slate. And part of our 10-point program is to explore third-party alternatives. And here in Vermont, we are very, very lucky to have such an alternative right at our fingertips. We have the Vermont Progressive Party, and they have been very, very supportive of labor's issues in particular. They've been showing up at our press conferences. They've been showing up at workplaces. They've been taking our priorities seriously, whereas unfortunately, the cases with the Democratic Party, they still do not think of working people and labor as an important constituency, and fail time and time again to prioritize our issues. And as far as the Republican Party go, we're the Republican Party is a little bit different in Vermont. They're more moderate than the National Republican Party in a lot of ways. But I have yet to see a pivot toward labor from that party as well.
I think it's fascinating. I was talking about this with one of my economist friends this morning, which is, the US has had 50 years of extraordinary economic growth, and across both sides of politics being in power, the ordinary person has received very little benefit from that. I went to my local cafe this morning, and the lady making the cappuccino said, why do you get so much more holiday in insert name of country? We were talking about Australia. And I said, well, that's not it. It's why do you get so little in the United States? Because across the rest of the Western world, it's a completely different equation. as to how people get looked after, even at that simple level of the amount of holiday you get. I guess my question to you is then, this whole issue of awareness, is the younger generation more aware of just how badly treated the ordinary American is compared to more or less every other developed country? I mean, I think about America as simply not being first world for most of its people. There's no little holidays, there's no healthcare. I'm fascinated in whether that is, there's growing awareness of that.
I would say so. Anecdotally, of course, we also have a great relationship here in Vermont with DSA, which brings in a lot of young people and connects, and they're very enthusiastic about the labor movement. And I talk to workers about what's important to them in their contracts. And I do hear from young people emphasizing the importance of PTO almost being as valuable as, if not more valuable than wage increases. Having that paid time off to professionally develop themselves or explore their hobbies or just spend time with their family and community, because that's where they get the most satisfaction. They really can't, like I said earlier, participate fully in the consumer culture that previous generations may have been able to. And, so that becomes hugely important for them in negotiations.
Nigel, one of the topics was looked like burnout from innovation. Did you have any observations about why there might be higher attrition or burnout from higher innovation, which sounds like that's a plus, not a minus?
I think that's really fascinating, that point in the article that I know we saw a little bit earlier on. Again, this is circumstantial, it's not quantitative, but for me, it must be all about culture. There are some really innovative companies you can work at, which are fantastic to work at, and they look after their people really well, and you hear only good things about it. And then there are other companies that are very innovative and doing really well, but Netflix has high staff turnover. SpaceX has insane, it's like 25% staff turnover. Goldman Sachs, in some numbers I saw, was about 15% staff, turnover. And these are, pretty high numbers. So it must go to the things that people care about, which is, so the company's cool and innovative, but does it care about its people? Mm-hmm. For me, that must be at the heart of it. It's the only thing for me that really makes sense.
Absolutely. And I think that's the next frontier in innovation in a meaningful sense. So, one of our biggest unions here in Vermont is AFL-CIO, and AFL-CIO has a new shop that's relatively new, called of a chocolatier called Rabble Rousers, and they're experimenting with a worker-owned co-op, which is probably going to be, I don't know, maybe one of the few in Vermont. I really don't know of too many, and nationally there's not many either. And they are really exploring like what it means to actually co-own an enterprise together, and how to be very cognizant of levels of ownership too in running this enterprise too. So they have a contract to still they have union representation, because they don't want to create a power imbalance between full owner and those who are only partial owners, the way to becoming full, because they didn't have the initial capital, but they're getting paycheck deductions so they can eventually become full owners. So it's really interesting to see how this can unfold. It's a relatively new experiment, but I talked to the workers at this workplace, and it is incredible how thoughtful they are about every aspect of it. And I'm really excited to see where worker co-ops and more of these kinds of initiatives lead to in terms of worker satisfaction and a thriving community.
I think that's incredibly important and very relevant, because if you think about the transition of the economy that's going on now, which is essentially jobs are migrating towards the thing that have an essential human element in some way, caring, creativity, communication, collaboration, themes like that. Those are capital-like businesses. They depend in part entirely on people. And so the people should be able to own those organizations and control their own destiny. Our own business, Pottinger, is like that. It's a knowledge and advice business involves caring for leaders essentially, and our business is entirely owned by the team, and that gives us control over our own destiny and is a wonderful place to be. It comes with some responsibilities too, but it gives people a freedom to do what they think is right rather than be beholden to something else. So I hope we will see much more of that. Sorry, Paul, you're about to ask a question.
Well, I was going to talk, like in Vermont, there's probably a fair number of co-ops, at least in agriculture and dairy and cheese and things like that. So it's interesting how some organizations are experimenting more with that type of ownership structure. In addition, companies, especially in Germany or Denmark, have labor unions on the board. And so that's both a positive and sometimes a negative, like when the Volkswagen crisis hit and about lying about the EPA emissions. There was a crisis at the top as to whether there need to be layoffs or not. And so at least the labor unions are part of the board to do that. But what Alex Edmonds, who's been a guest on ESGX, professor at London Business School, has shown in his research is in most countries around the world, great places to work are great investments. So better for you as an investor, because a lot of those excess benefits from innovation, the innovation we're just talking about, creates excess benefits, and those flow to the shareholder, except in 2 countries in his analysis. And those 2 countries were Denmark and Germany, and those are 2 places where labor gains the benefits rather than the shareholder gains the benefits. So Liz, have you seen anything in those ownership structures that creates a better environment for workers, co-ops versus corporations versus nonprofits versus other types?
Yeah, it's hard to say if there's like definitive pattern because there's different kinds of co-ops, right? There's worker-owned co-ops in which workers actually have capital in the business and tend to have more of a say in how it's run. And then there's consumer co-ops, which a lot of our food co-ops are consumer co-ops. Where buyers are also buy a share into it, and those consumer co-ops, a lot of them are unionized here in Vermont. So I think if it weren't for the union, there probably wouldn't be as much worker participation and better benefits and all the good things that unions. The cooperative model really only goes so far. You have a board, but usually on these co-op boards, there's only a few seats, maybe only one sometimes for a worker. So if you don't have a union there as well to bring management to the table and add additional voice, then I think you probably aren't going to get as large of a share in terms of the productivity gains or other benefits to labor. So I think it's really interesting to see this. I'd love to see this in partnership with labor unions, but I think labor unions have a critical role in making sure the co-op model ultimately serves the workers.
And Dr. Fadal, in your research and observations across Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity Research and your work at Denison University, what have you seen about different ownership models or relationships with labor?
I think I would defer to you, Paul, on this particular one. But on one point I wanted to add before we wrap up today is the kind of the reality check of what's happening in the public discourse right now, which is, all the efforts that we put into the pandemic on the public policy front to bring in the child tax credits to support lower income families, the COVID relief funding, all of that is now being blamed for the inflation spike. And we're going to see, number one, the Fed raising interest rates to slow down the economy. And number two, Congress not spending as much and pulling back a lot of the support that we've seen in the middle of a pandemic that's not over yet, right? So what concerns me is this hijacking of the narrative of kind of blaming the inflation spike on the little bit of progress we've seen and pulling all of that back. And I think it's very important for labor unions to kind of push back against this narrative and articulate that the real sources of inflation have nothing to do with the additional fiscal spending. It's supply chain disruptions related purely to the COVID pandemic. So if we don't end the pandemic, we're going to keep getting the disruptions. We're going to keep getting global inflation pressure points. And number two, it has to do with some abusive market power in the US corporate sector. And that's been, blatant. I mean, we've heard CEOs reporting, saying the pricing environment has been favorable and reporting record profits. So if we don't really push on this front, that the gains on the corporate level are really going to the top and going to shareholders, and that this is the moment for a great reshuffle when it comes to the distribution of income, then they're going to use this narrative for the next several decades to blame any kind of inflation that we see in the future on social spending, on economic relief. Yeah. So it's important to organize, but it's also important to have a coherent narrative to justify why a more equitable distribution, a more greener transition, healthier transition is actually a net benefit for everyone, and not be distracted with this COVID-related inflation that we're experiencing.
Yeah, Liz, would you like to summarize for us, and then we'll start?
Yeah, absolutely. I wish most working people here in Vermont were getting a 7% wage increase, and they certainly aren't. So, it is not the fault of the workers or increased, those stimulus checks or anything like that. Who sets the prices at the end of the day? It's the people in charge, right? It's management. It's the corporations and their boards, right? And Professor Richard Wolff points this out over and over, which I appreciate, and so do you all, which is really important. And the fact that, we aren't actually making enough of an investment in actually producing the goods and services that people need to survive is an underlying cause of inflation, as Dr. Fadel Kabuba has said as well multiple times. And so, we're seeing that here in Vermont. There's all this talk of, building a Green New Deal and workforce development all the time in Vermont, but where are the workers going to live? Our vacancy rate here in Vermont is around 2 or 3% in some areas. There's not enough housing. It's hard to get healthcare in a privatized health system. So, we actually need to invest more in the right ways in order to actually combat inflation in a meaningful sense. And organized labor has, really been trying to get our fair share. And we haven't been receiving it for decades. Labor's share of productivity has been going down and down, or remaining stagnant. And so have wages. We're seeing a little bit of gains because of this moment, but we aren't really getting actually all of that money from higher prices or anything like that, and we're not setting them. And I think labor, of course, needs to be more aggressive in organizing and fighting for big, bold programs like a Green New Deal that has the social question at its heart, has housing and healthcare and social programs at its heart to provide for those basic needs in order to actually meaningfully have a sustainable, healthy, equitable economy that's green and just for all. So that's what I would conclude.
All right, we packed a lot in today. Thanks to you, Liz, and your leadership and helping everyday workers earn fair compensation and be treated in a positive and constructive and empowering way. So appreciate all of your leadership in Vermont and for workers. So thanks for joining us today. Dr. Fadel, thanks for your insights and wisdom as always. Amir, thanks for your monthly Green Jobs report. And thanks to our producer, Nick Gower, making everything run smoothly and organizing us for success. Over to you, Nigel, to preview what's coming up in the next ESGXs, and appreciate you being my co-host as always.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, thank you all very much. And please do take a moment to use the like button on YouTube to share this with more people. You should all have an email giving you a link to today's show and a link to register for next week. Sorry, in a fortnight's time. And coming up, what we have is a discussion which takes what we've taken today, or talked about today, further and looks at, in particular, Australia, which is a poster child for an old economy industry, very dependent on extractive industries, lots of mining, politics, which has supported that and has really inhibited investment in things that are more related to the future, including renewables and a bioeconomy and so forth. And so we're going to be exploring, what are the measures that are required really to drive this change? Where should we be trying to encourage investment? And we'll do this through the eyes of Australia, not least because there's an election coming up and all this will be very topical. And also because we have a report coming out in the next few weeks, which will put some more detail behind this. But this is also a great window on what is relevant for everywhere else too. So thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again very soon.